think in the gospel passage we can look around ourselves this morning and say, well, no one's selling sheep or oxen, so we're okay. That doesn't, we can check that off and move forward because it doesn't have anything to do with us. And yet I think obviously at the same time, if we look at it, I think there is some takeaways for us, even though no one is here in church selling animals this morning. And I think that it isn't so much that it was about money. That wasn't the thing that first and foremost, I think, moved Christ. In fact, Pope Francis touched on this yesterday in his homily a little bit as well. But instead, it was that the people who were there selling things had forgotten why they were there and forgotten what that place was for. And they had placed something ahead of the right reason for being there. They had placed something ahead of love for God and in a desire to worship God in a true and a pure way. And so they had placed something ahead of that. And so although we might not, we obviously aren't selling animals here today, we too, I think, have the temptation sometimes to place motivations besides honoring God, besides worshiping God. We have motivations sometimes to place things ahead of God, and that might be the reason that some of us are here. And so for those people that were selling things, God might have been the second or third reason that they were there, or to honor and worship God, but it might not have been their first reason. And so we have to, I think we do well today, I think, to ask ourselves, is honoring God, is worshiping God, the first reason that we're here today? And then as an extension, is honoring God, worshiping God, giving praise to God, my first motivation for all of the things that I do? My work, my family, anything that I do every day is my first motivation for God and to honor God. And what we heard in the first reading is that God suffers no rivals. And that's not because God has an ego issue. It's not because God is like, honor me and worship me and bow down. God is saying, not because he's mean, but God is suggesting to us, look, if I'm not first in your heart, things don't work right. I'm not saying worship me because I have an ego issue. I'm not saying it for any other reason than for love of you. When you put something in place of honoring God, things don't work. Things don't work as they should. And that is, I think, the thing that maybe that Christ is trying to get across to us in today's gospel. Pope Francis yesterday as well, talking about this gospel, somehow came across this homily, and he was saying that today's gospel is really about true worship. True worship. Not about false worship. It's about making sure that our worship is pure, our motivations are pure for being here and for offering our time to God. And it's so often we hear very trivial things about why people don't worship, or there's very trivial reasons that people put in front of worshiping God. People say things like, I don't like that song, or I do like that song, or I don't like that sermon, or I do like that sermon, or I don't like that priest, or I go to that church because I do like that priest, or I don't like the architecture, it's too big, and that church is too small, and at that church they're all a bunch of hypocrites, and you have to know certain people, you can't get anything done, and you have to be a member of whatever. I don't go because it's boring. All of these things, you hear all of these things, motivations and things that people put in place of what really has to be at the top of our list, and that is worshiping God and coming and giving praise to the Father. And so what we find, I think, is that just as Christ in the temple comes storming in, he too wants to come storm into our lives. We hear in the book of Revelation that Christ says, I stand at the door and knock. I stand at the door of your heart and I knock. But the amazing thing and the awesome thing about how God set things up is that Christ doesn't kick the door down. He doesn't go, Arnold Schwarzenegger on the door and just come storming in. He gives us the opportunity to keep the door shut. And that really is the ultimate decision that we have to make. That's the decision that rests in our power as human beings. Will I open the door? And a lot of times people keep it shut because we know what Christ is going to do. We know Christ is kind of like this crazy guy in a good way, but the crazy guy that we hear about in the gospel. if we let Christ in, we're like, I got stuff set in my heart, kind of how I like it. I've got things arranged in a certain way, and yeah, not everything's working really great, but I'm comfortable with how things are, and so I'm going to keep you outside because I've heard of your reputation. I heard what you do when you come in, and so I'm going to let you keep knocking, but I'm going to keep you outside. And that, I think, is the question that we have to ask ourselves. Christ comes in like this madman, out of love, mad and wild with love, not pride, not anger, nothing else other than love for us. He comes charging in to cleanse us, to cleanse our hearts, to drive out all of those other secondary motivations or even sinful motivations sometimes. He comes to cleanse and purify, and so does His Spirit. The Holy Spirit comes to purify as well. The Holy Spirit is a fire, and fire burns things. And the fire of the Spirit burns away all the imperfections and cleanses us in a good way. And all that's left behind is the things that can stand the test of fire, the things that are true and good and holy. But again, we can keep the Spirit out as well. And so I think we do well to ask ourselves, first and foremost, why are we here? What's our first motivation for being here? And why are those that aren't here? What can I do to help them come here and experience true worship, experience worship of the Father, experience the Sabbath day that Christ encourages us so strongly to honor? What can I do to help those who have fallen away or who are not here place God back first in their life, among their priorities? And then as well, do I let Christ into my own heart? Do I let the Spirit into my own heart? Or do I keep Christ outside because I'm afraid of what will happen next? This Lent provides another opportunity for us to open the door to Christ, to let Christ in to our hearts, to let Christ reorder and put things back in the order that they belong in our hearts, in our lives, in our spirit. We must let Christ in. We must let the Spirit into our hearts. And we must do what Christ told His disciples many, many times. We must not be afraid.